Now we are going to show you another failure of Russian troops near the Volodar town in Ukraine. A column of 6 Russian tanks and 1 infantry fighting vehicle began an attack on Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainian troops let them approach the edge of the town where they ambushed them with javelin missiles. When the tanks approached the right distance, the Ukrainian troops opened fire. The first tank was immediately knocked out of the game. Then the Ukrainians destroyed another tank, and then one more. The armored vehicle pushed forward but was also hit by a Ukrainian missile. The Russians are forced to abandon their vehicle as it catches fire. They press their heads to the ground, expecting the vehicle to explode. Perhaps it is full of ammunition. Then the Ukrainians began to hunt down the remaining tanks. One of the tanks noticed the Ukrainian troops' ambush and began shooting at them while retreating. Unfortunately, the Ukrainians missed the tank this time. Meanwhile, the previously hit tank spectacularly exploded from the detonation of the shells. Almost nothing was left of the tank except for scraps of metal. The abandoned Russian armored vehicle burned for a long time, but eventually exploded as well. In fact, Ukrainians halted a major Russian offensive. This infuriates the Russians, and they call for the help of the most fierce artillery, the Soln-Sepayak hours. All of this happens quickly, and within a few minutes, dangerous missiles rain down on the Ukrainian positions. Russian commanders often make emotional, impulsive decisions at this moment. They spare no ammunition, even though they are already experiencing a shortage of them in the front lines. Let's hope that the Ukrainian soldiers were able to escape from there. The next day, the Ukrainians destroyed 2 more Russian tanks. One of the tanks was hit by a javelin missile and soon caught fire. The second tank spotted the Ukrainian position and decided to attack it, but it also received a hit from an anti-tank missile. In the video, you can see some part of it flying off in a spiral trajectory. But the tank continued moving, increasing its speed until it hit a mine on the road. Javelin missiles continued to provide invaluable assistance to the Ukrainians in repelling attacks, and the Russians are still unable to resist them. And here's my favorite case of using a javelin missile. A Ukrainian soldier let 2 Russian tanks pass by, and that came out of hiding behind them and destroyed them. This is a true guerrilla warfare. Here are a few more accurate hits on Russian armored vehicles. A camera installed on a Russian tank captured the moment when a tank ahead of it was destroyed by a Ukrainian javelin missile. Currently, Ukrainian soldiers have more of these missiles. Sometimes Ukrainian forces even use them when they are not needed. For example, we see a Russian tank that is already disabled by Ukrainians, fired another javelin missile at it, probably to finish it up. Ukrainian forces also use another type of anti-tank missiles to American. How missiles installed on the Humvee armored vehicle have proven to be very effective. They never miss. The Ukrainians use British Brimstone missiles to target important Russian military equipment. These missiles are several times more powerful than javelin missiles. It can be launched from a regular civilian truck. They hit their targets very accurately. The video captured the destruction of a Russian Tu-3 howitzer that exploded along with its ammunition. Here's another video showing the destruction of another howitzer somewhere on the southern front that also exploded with its ammunition. Brimstone missiles are well suited for targeting clusters of enemy equipment. Last year, Ukrainian forces destroyed a lot of Russian military vehicles using these missiles after successfully repelling the Russian attack. Ukrainian tanks launched a counterattack to reclaim Russian positions. In these videos, we see a Ukrainian tank boldly approach Russian trenches and destroy a fortified position with direct fire. Shortly after, Ukrainian M113 armored personnel carrier opened machine gun fire on Russian infantry. Ukrainian soldiers disembarked and cleared the trenches. It was a successful operation. I found it interesting that Ukrainian tanks often closely approach Russian trenches and shoot at them point blank, and the Russians can do nothing about it. This may mean that they have an acute shortage of anti-tank weapons. Ukrainians are increasingly using tanks in counterattacks if they need to clear a road of mines before proceeding. They use the American M58 mine clearing system. It's very helpful. However, the Russians continue to send live troops to the front line, fearing the loss of many tanks. They rely on regular soldiers. Armored vehicles deliver several Russian platoons to the front line and then retreat back. The soldiers capture new positions in the forest. Later, a few more armored vehicles brought in additional assault Russian platoons. Their task is to create and hold fortified positions in this area. However, the Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance is observing everything and knows where to strike. Shortly after, the Ukrainians launch a powerful attack on the Russians using a guided JDAM bomb. Surviving such bombs is almost impossible as it hazes the soldier with the ground and fire. Meanwhile, the Russians have almost captured the Bakhmut city. They brought tanks and armored vehicles into the city and are squeezing Ukrainian forces out. A Russian tank is firing directly at a Ukrainian position in a multi-story building. Look at the most advanced Russian tank, the -90-meter, which is very rare in Russian army, but was brought here for the purpose of filming and used for Russian television. Recently, one of these tanks was discovered in the United States and taken to Louisiana for research purposes. However, the Russian tanks in Bakhmut don't last long. Soon they turn into scrap metal. Also note how the Ukrainian drone drops a bomb on a moving Russian tank. We haven't seen anything like this before. The task of the Ukrainian army here is very simple: to destroy as much Russian tanks and other armored vehicles as possible. Ukrainians have good air reconnaissance and monitor everything that happens as a result of accurate hits. The Russians are losing more and more Russian armored vehicles, and tanks constantly burn and explode on approach to the city or in the city itself. And Russian fighter aircrafts which still dare to fly around the city also crash and explode. Recently, we have seen several videos of downed Russian planes. Russians often forget they don't have air superiority in Ukraine. On the eastern region of Bakhmut, the Russians have set up a command post and a well-preserved building. They also install radio, electronic reconnaissance antennas and backwards, usually on the top of tall buildings. Ukrainian intelligence learned about this and launched an artillery strike on the command post. The headquarters caught fire, as did all the military equipment nearby. Later, the building was completely engulfed in flames. Then the building exploded and collapsed as there were many ammunition inside. The Ukrainians also destroyed reconnaissance systems using kamikaze drones. By the way, using small drones, Ukrainians are inflicting serious damage to Russian troops. Take a look at these video clips. Russians are firing from an armored vehicle when suddenly they get hit by a Ukrainian drone. Another armored personnel carrier also gets hit by a drone, and then another one. There are rumors that Ukrainian forces may use tens of thousands of such drones during the next counteroffensive. Overall, the Russians are fully preparing for defense. To do this, they blow up bridges so that the Ukrainians cannot pass over them in future counterattacks. Tensions have been rising in Crimea recently. Internationally, Crimea is officially Ukrainian territory, and Ukrainian forces are diverting their attacks to Crimea to reclaim its legal right. The historical peninsula is frequently shaken by drone and missile attacks. Crimea has hosted numerous attacks in recent weeks, including multiple drone attacks on the region's largest city, Sebastopol. As the Kiev leader has often emphasized, the key Crimean and Ukrainian forces that will end the war are attacking with all their might. For this, the offensive operations in many parts of Crimea are making the Kremlin administration and the Russian army very uneasy. The focus of these attacks is to liberate Crimea again. To this end, Kiev is accelerating its offensive operations in Crimea. The attacks of Kiev greatly frighten the Kremlin administration, and the Russian army fear by the Ukrainian armed forces is causing Russian soldiers to flee Crimea. the evacuation of Russian headquarters in Crimea, and the evacuation of Russian military families. Last month, the Russian-backed military authorities of Crimea announced the evacuation of Russian military families from the peninsula. It was a sharp move unleashed by great anxiety and fear. It was also an indication that the Russians could not cope with the Ukrainian attacks. In addition, the evacuation of Russian headquarters outside of the Crimea in the past weeks was a vivid symbol of the uneasiness of the Russians. Ukraine's attacks on Crimea, Sevastopol, Simferopol, and near the Kerch Bridge were quite intense. The soldiers and commanders of the Russian army stationed in the Crimea could not stand this pressure any longer. Urgent support and evacuation requests were going to the Kremlin. In this week's update, British intelligence revealed a very dire situation for the Russian military in Crimea. According to British intelligence, the Russian-backed leader of Crimea, Sergei Aksyonov, is also concerned about the Russian army's ability to defend the peninsula. British intelligence pointed out that the main element of the Russian garrison, the 22nd Cause, has now mostly fled outside the peninsula and has suffered heavy losses. The majority of the fleeing soldiers belong to the 22nd Russian Corps. The 22nd Russian Corps is a unit of the coastal defense units of the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Navy, established in 2017 after the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. The cause is headquartered in Simferopol and controls units based in Crimea. However, the 22nd Corps is the main element of the Russian garrison, is now mostly stationed outside the peninsula and has suffered heavy losses. The cause has a total of 40,000 soldiers. The casualties of these soldiers are estimated to be over 5,000, and the exact figures remain unclear. But it's estimated that the vast majority of the soldiers suffered from the Kiev attacks. After the evacuated Russian military bases in Crimea, it's estimated that only around 10,000 Russian soldiers from the 22nd Corps remained on the peninsula. In other words, it is seen that around 30,000 Russian soldiers fled. Also, the 22nd Russian Corps is a paramilitary group. As is known, in the last 20 years, Russia has experienced the proliferation of paramilitary groups in its regular armed forces. However, this paramilitarization has accelerated dramatically since Russia's attempt to invade Ukraine. Paramilitarization has reached particularly significant proportions in the Crimean Peninsula. UK Defense Intelligence reported Sergei Aksyonov, the leader of the Russian occupation administration in temporarily occupied Crimea, was instrumental in establishing several local units that often claimed to be affiliated with the Kazakh tradition. Most units were given semi-official status as reserve units of the regular army. According to UK Defense Intelligence, the Russian-backed leader of Crimea, Sergei Aksyonov, is keen to polish his patriotic identity by recruiting fighters, but is also likely worried about the regular army's ability to defend the peninsula. The UK Defense Ministry reported that Aksyonov will turn to recruit more paramilitary groups outside Russia's official military ranks to support the defense of Crimea against attacks. In fact, Aksyonov is not unjustified in his concerns because Crimea is regularly attacked and the Russian army cannot prevent these attacks. The measures taken by Russia in Crimea do not seem to have relieved the authorities or the people of Crimea. The peninsula, shaken by the attacks, is being evacuated by evacuations. A Ukrainian official said that thousands of Russians fled Crimea and abandoned their properties, fearing that an expected counterattack by Ukraine might target the Black Sea Peninsula. About 500,000 to 800,000 Russians currently live in Crimea illegally. Russians may be forcibly deported in accordance with Ukrainian legislation and international legal norms. Fearing this possibility, Russian citizens sell their properties and leave Crimea. The Russian evacuation of Crimea is also seen in the real estate market. It's not possible to say the exact number by looking at the real estate market, but there are many who leave. On the other hand, it turned out that the Russian administrations in Crimea were preparing evacuation plans for their employees. Russian authorities on the peninsula are making a list of workers and their families who are subject to priority evacuation. In fact, it is among the information that escape plans have already been created and approved in some cities. It was announced that such a plan was being prepared in the northern part of the peninsula, close to the Ukrainian mainland in the town of Krasno-Perekopsk. It seems that Crimea is now becoming a region where both civilians and soldiers long to escape. So how are the attacks that caused the Russian soldiers and civilians to flee on the peninsula? And what methods does Ukraine use to target Crimea? Crimea has hosted many massive attacks in recent weeks. Last night, Ukrainian drones illuminated the skies of Crimea. The drone swarm launched simultaneous offensive operations in many areas of Crimea. Last week, Crimea was also the scene of what regional officials described as an act of sabotage. It was reported that the explosions caused a train to derail, which led to the suspension of rail traffic between Sevastopol and Simferopol, the capital of Crimea. 8 grain wagons derailed as a result of the explosions. 15 meters of the track was damaged and a 1.5 meters long crater was formed under the tracks. An explosion on the railroad tracks in Crimea disrupted deliveries of supplies and weapons to the Kremlin's Black Sea Fleet, including Caliber cruise missiles, according to a report by the UK Ministry of Defence, citing intelligence data on Twitter. The disruption of delivery dealt serious blows to Russian logistics. Crimea is critical to Moscow's control over the occupied territories in southern and eastern Ukraine and plays a role in the supply of Russian troops. Military experts say the attacks on the infrastructure served to disrupt Russian military plans and make it difficult for Moscow to prepare for the anticipated Ukrainian counterattack. Russia is trying to strengthen its defense in Crimea as it cannot resist offensive operations. Crimea used to be known for its seaside resorts. The coastline, stretching for 25 kilometers, is now filled with defensive structures filled by Russian troops instead of sun loungers and umbrellas. It has dragon teeth made up of pyramid-shaped concrete blocks designed to block the way for tanks and other military vehicles along the coast. Behind the dragon's teeth are a series of shields that protect against incoming attacks. Several bunkers can also be seen along the trenches. Ukraine also has a big trump card against the measures taken by Russia. This trump card is the powerful Western tanks that Kiev has. These dragon teeth can be crushed and eliminated by Western tanks. Also, some military experts argue that the defenses are a precaution as Ukraine has very little naval capability. Ukraine's options to attack the peninsula have increased after the U.S. administration said that it could target Crimea with American weapons. Attacks on Crimea target critical logistics lines for Russia. As a result of these attacks, Russian supply is disrupted. This situation also demoralizes the Russians and deprives them of the resources they need. Crimean attacks do not have a military dimension. Only these attacks also caused social collapse and psychological fatigue. It's only a matter of time before social collapse brings with it uprisings and rebellions. Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, who is said to have held talks with senior US officials, has stunned the whole world with his move. This move of Lukashenko, who did not allow the Russian army to enter Ukraine from Belarusian territory, drove Russian leader Vladimir Putin crazy. Putin called an emergency meeting at the Kremlin Palace and held a private meeting with Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff. Putin, who wanted to expand the territories he occupied in Ukraine, wanted to launch a major ground offensive over the border with Belarus. Putin was aware that he will quickly occupy the capital, Kiev, if he enters Ukrainian territory through the Belarusian border, has started troop shipments to Belarus. This plan of the Russian army, which planned to move towards Kiev with a large army, was presented in a very interesting way. The unexpected move of Belarusian President Lukashenko drove Russian leader Vladimir Putin crazy. Here are the details of the news. US intelligence service officials recently informed Ukrainian government officials that there was a great deal of activity on Belarus's border with Ukraine and that the Russian army could launch a new attack on Ukrainian territory through Belarus. Shortly after this warning, it was learned that the Russian government started to organize a large military deployment to the Belarusian border with the order of Russian Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov to S-400 air defense systems. A large number of tanks and armored vehicles started to be shipped to the Belarusian border territory. Then the images of the shipment, which was carried out by train, were video recorded by the people of the region and shared on social media platforms. The eyes of the whole world turned to Putin again. Russian leader Putin has started to increase security measures on the Belarusian border by making 3 different military shipments to the Belarusian border in the last week. The Russian army, which placed air defense systems on Belarusian borderlands, interestingly, began to protect Belarusian territory. Afterwards, it was noticed that Putin had deployed a large number of armored vehicles, and tanks here started to transfer many Russian troops fighting in Ukraine to the Belarusian border. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said that the U.S. intelligence service has reported that there is a great deal of activity on the borders of Belarus and that Russia could launch a new attack on Ukraine from there. The U.S. Minister Austin's response to these statements was not too late. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu denied the U.S. accusations, saying that the military shipments sent to the Belarusian border were for an exercise and that Belarusian soldiers would be trained. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, who allegedly met with senior U.S. officials in recent months, did not object to the Russian troops entering the Belarusian border. In response to Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky, who decided to increase security measures on the border with Belarus, started to deploy nearly 10,000 Ukrainian troops to the Belarusian border to take precautions against a new Russian attack. Zelensky has asked for support from its Western allies, saying that the Ukrainian army needs more tanks and long-range missiles. While the whole world was waiting for the Russian army to launch a new attack on Ukrainian territory through Belarusian borders. But the Russian leader Lukashenko surprised everyone by closing the border gates to Russian troops. With a sudden change of decision, Lukashenko activated the Belarusian border guards and started to take a major security measure at the Belarusian border gates. Thousands of Belarusian soldiers are trying to ensure border security in order to prevent the Russian army from crossing Ukrainian territory. However, Lukashenko's move surprised Putin and many Western leaders. The Russian army was trapped in Belarusian territory after the Belarusian army prevented Russian troops from crossing into Ukrainian territory. Confused Russian leader Vladimir Putin asked for a meeting with his counterpart, Alexander Lukashenko, but the Belarusian government rejected Putin's request for a meeting. According to sources close to the Kremlin, the Russian government believes that Alexander Lukashenko has reached an agreement with the United States. However, according to war analysts, Lukashenko is trying to distance himself from Russia for a very different reason. War analysts say that Lukashenko is aware that the Russian army is losing the war on the territory of Ukraine and is now trying to get closer to the US and Western countries instead of Russia. However, Lukashenko's move has left a big question in mind. Will Vladimir Putin impose any sanctions on Belarus over Lukashenko's move? We do not know the answer to this yet, but Vladimir Putin and Alexander Lukashenko are expected to hold a meeting in the coming weeks. After 15 months of occupying Ukrainian territory, the Russian army has started to lose many of the territories it occupied. The Russian army, which managed to quickly occupy Ukrainian territory in the first months of the war, is now trying to protect the captured territories. Russian forces, which have moved from an offensive position to a defense position, have been in a very difficult situation recently. Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who wanted to resume his occupation in Ukraine, wanted to make a move that would turn the course of the war back in favor of Russia. However, Alexander Lukashenko, The president of Belarus, who is known to have good relations with Vladimir Putin, did not allow Putin if everything had gone according to Vladimir Putin's plan. The Russian army could have been advancing towards the capital, Kiev, while Lukashenko made this move is still a matter of curiosity. While this tension between Russia and Belarus continues, Russian leader Vladimir Putin has been betrayed one after another. The number of Iranian-made unmanned warplanes used by the Russian army to launch air strikes on Ukrainian territory has been greatly reduced. Putin, who has built unmanned fighter jets from Iran again in recent months, now wants to send these unmanned fighter jets back to Iran because they broke in unmanned combat drones that Iran, known as Russia's allies, sold to Russia, turned out to be unusable. The Iranian government refuses to take back these broken unmanned combat drones sold to Russia. But did Iran really sell unmanned fighter jets to Russia that are not yet ready? Russia claims that they cannot use the unmanned fighter jets purchased from Iran due to systemic failures. Putin, who is known to have secretly purchased unmanned fighter jets from Iran after Turkey's announcement that it would not sell unmanned fighter jets to Russia, is in trouble. US officials have repeatedly stated that the Iranian government wants a C-35 fighter jets from Russia in exchange for these unmanned fighter jets. Immediately after this agreement between Russia and Iran, the Iranian government shipped the unmanned fighter jets to Russia, and the Russian military conducted the first tests a few days after this agreement was reached, and the first tests were carried out. It was discovered that these unmanned fighter jets purchased from Iran were missing parts and therefore could not take off. This note indicated that in the first trials conducted by the Russian military, the Iranian unmanned combat drones had systemic errors and were not fully efficient. However, it was later understood that these unmanned fighter jets were completely broken. It is also reported that the Russian government is not at all satisfied with the unmanned fighter jets from Iran. This issue has come up many times before, but the source of this information remains a mystery. It is still a matter of curiosity whether Iran, which has been supporting the Russian army since the beginning of the war, is doing this deliberately. Even though the US administration has warned Iran against providing military equipment to Russia, the Iranian government continues to send covert support to Russia. Israeli intelligence service officials say that cargo planes belonging to the Russian Defense Ministry arrived from Russia to Iranian borders and that they detected that these cargo planes were carrying military equipment and unmanned fighter jets belonging to the Iranian army. It seems that the Russian military will continue to commit war crimes with these unmanned warplanes on Ukrainian territory. The US administration may warn Iran again in the near future.